Hello, we are the Pilgrims of Plunder, and we have returned. We're going to talk today about a topic that came upon my mind a couple of weeks ago. And it was an interesting question that someone in church asked me. And at first I answered, and then I changed my mind. We were talking about the Reformed tradition, and I've said I've been trying to figure out various denominations on what to join and how to judge other denominations. And I realized I'm more Reformed than evangelical. So I'll go to PCA or different OPC or different Presbyterian denominations and ask them, are you first Reformed or are you evangelical? And I had a parishioner ask me, well, isn't Reformed just simply under evangelical? And my first response was, well, yeah, evangelical is the giant, broad definition of conservative Protestantism, and Reform's underneath it. And I thought about it. I'm like, no, that's not true. That's not true. And so I started pondering, what's the difference between Protestant and evangelical? And with Greg's patience, I'm going to ramble just quickly to get those terms defined. Protestant, of course, well, let me start the other way. Evangelical was the original name of the Protestants. The folks who are trying to reform the church in the Reformation said, we are the gospel men. We want the evangel. Well, I can't. I'm tired. This is going to be a long day. The evangel, sure, there it is.
Nailed
Go
it.
for it. And so they took on the word, this is gonna be a fun episode. So they took on the name evangelical, but they soon, like so many names in the church, were labeled by their opponents, and you guys are a bunch of protesters, right? Protestants, and the name kind of stuck. So Protestant is a generic label for all those who come from the Reformation: Lutheran, Reformed, Anglican, Congregational, Presbyterians, Baptists, and so on and so forth. Evangelical has gone through several different meanings. Evangelical, again, was the original name for the Protestants. It was a label in some European countries given to a denomination when they tried to bring things together. For instance, in Germany in the 19th century, there was an attempt to bring, by the king or the prince of some German province, bringing the Lutherans and the Reformed together. And he gave them the label evangelical. And this can get very confusing because I worked in the Midwest in the 90s, and there was a denomination called Evangelical, and they went liberal. And it was very confusing because the other main definition of the word evangelical, coined in the 20th century, refers to conservative Protestants. And in particular, they were Protestants that weren't fundamentalists. They didn't want to be considered crazy fundamentalists, but they were conservative. So in the 1980s and 1990s, in general American parlance, you had two groups. You had the liberal Christians and the evangelical. And I was raised in a very liberal denomination, so I always went by the label evangelical. However, like I said, this is going to be a long ramble. Evangelical, I believe, more and more is actually a tradition, where Protestantism is not a tradition in the sense of it stands by itself. You have to be something under Protestant. If you're a Protestant, okay, what kind of Protestant are you? Are you Lutheran? Are you Reformed? Whatever. You can just be evangelical. So it's a different tradition. So maybe when it originally was coined for the modern use in the 20th century, you could be a Presbyterian evangelical as opposed to a Presbyterian liberal. But I think it's really morphed into its own tradition. So now it's kind of either or. Yes, there's some overlap. I mean, I generally believe we should go and evangelize the world. I believe in the inerrancy of Scripture. But that minimalistic approach to evangelicalism, I reject. And that's really what the tradition is all about. We're not liberals. We believe in the Bible. We believe in evangelism, but there's a real pragmatism to it. And I am more and more bailing on the label. I say I'm not an evangelical because for most modern people, evangelical means Rick Warren and Joel Osteen. And I'm certainly not of that tradition. Well, I hope that makes some coherent sense. What do you think, Greg?
Episode's over. Good job.
Yeah.
Yeah, done. Yes. And I always tend to use the term, I don't know if it's out of necessity. I only view evangelicalism as modern. And in fact, your rant was helpful, again, giving a history to the term evangelical, which sort of makes it more understandable even to just say modern evangelical, which is never a good term. but modern evangelicalism is theologically a bad term, or at least doxologically a bad
Really?
term.
New word. Yay.
New words. Look, everybody gets to do it, so
We're
can I.
speaking in tongues, friends. I hope
Right.
someone gets
Yep.
the
Somebody
gift of
interpret. I'll
interpretation to
also
watching this
interpret.
thing. Oh, yeah.
Not necessarily, not exclusively matters of theology, the study of God, but also that matter of doxology and the systems of worship. And I view modern evangelicalism, of course, being its own thing. Both. I do appreciate the distinction that you made, and I think that that's an interesting point to ponder about evangelicalism being its own tradition now, because Protestantism then is also a tradition. We're saying, right, by the it's a parent category, right? Are you
There's a difference. Yeah, there is no first Protestant church of insert town name,
right? But you do
but
have
you can have,
evangelical
but you,
churches.
yeah, if you say you're
Okay.
Protestant, you
Oh,
got to be
oh,
something underneath it,
right.
but you can
Okay,
just
right.
say, I'm
Yes.
an evangelical. And I think
Yes.
that's the big difference.
Nobody says they're a Protestant. I mean, the only time that you claim to be Protestant is in the contrast
Military
against Roman Catholic. Because
or in the military. Or, well, at least in World War II, the basis of all military things, you were Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish.
sure.
That was your
Right,
three
because
options.
but again, that's to differentiate you from
Yeah,
Roman Catholic.
yeah, exactly,
Right,
exactly.
okay.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't necessarily be, so then is evangelicalism on the level of Protestantism, or is evangelicalism
I
under
don't think so, because I think there
Protestantism?
is a difference. Evangelicalism, again, it was to be worthy conservative Protestants.
Right.
That's how I always
So you're
interpreted
still
it
a
when I
Protestant because you're not Roman
right,
Catholic.
but Protestant could be liberal or something else. The term, again, was really coined, what, 1950s, 1940s, Billy Graham and oh, who was the other gentleman who created Christianity Today?
I
Got
don't
his
know.
name.
I wasn't
But
alive.
but the focus was, again, we're not liberal Protestants. We're not the crazy fundamentalist. However, and George Marsden, the historian on these movements, argued there's four basic things to evangelicalism, at least in its mid 20th century taking, was a focus on conversion, focus on the authority of the Bible, a focus on the cross, and a focus on activism. That is what defined evangelicalism.
Okay.
So we're not crazy fundamentalists. For them, you don't have to believe in a young earth creation or speak in tongues or whatever. We're just generic conservative Protestants focusing on conversion, the Bible, the cross, and being active in society. And so within that, you could have
Okay.
a wide variety of different Protestants. In some ways, it was a weird mixture of 19th century Presbyterian intellectualism from like Warfield and Hodge with that revivalistic thing of the Baptists and the Methodists that
Right.
kind of grouped together. Actually, one of the first public uses of the word was interesting enough was in Time magazine in the 70s. They had the year of the evangelical because originally the evangelical label was given to the Democrats because Jimmy Carter ran as an evangelical Protestant, a Bible
Okay.
believing, born again, filled in the Spirit. Now that coalition didn't work, and so the Democrats became hardcore atheists, and the Republicans took up the banner of the evangelical. But we talk about today the evangelical vote, which means again
Right.
conservative Protestant, but we don't use that word Protestant anymore. But I really think there is a difference. And,
Hmm.
again, we try to make them the same thing. I don't think that's the case.
Right. Yeah, I always view, I don't personally use the term evangelical. I mean, like as I don't identify as an evangelical. um because again, that to me has a negative connotation. You had mentioned um Warren, and as I have recently in my private studies been embarking upon Protestant church history, reading through the Westminster Standards and now reading the oh my goodness, Cambridge
This is
platform.
what happens when we do things in the afternoon.
I know, because I never
Directory of
remember the
Public Worship,
Cambridge
the
directly. I
Westminster
always have to
Full.
think Massachusetts. It's in Massachusetts. What's in Massachusetts? Like it's Cambridge.
Because you fled the promised land of New England, so your mind has been
No,
fogged because you
no,
live
that's
in the
not true.
land of
Um,
Baptists. So,
so no, I am an evangelical missionary from Connecticut to spread the word of Congregationalism. So
hey, you could be a missionary of TRC,
I'm not
our
even a
first
member.
missionary.
So an honorary member of your church. All right. So the
Sorry.
I'm already I already am I'm already a member of a church. The Cambridge. So in reading these things, um, on point. One of the things that I did appreciate again about in the Westminster Confessions is that they have two publications amidst all of those, one of which is the Directory of Public Worship and the other is the Directory of Private Worship. For any who don't understand those terms or know what those writings are, the Directory of Public Worship is essentially Puritan liturgy, I guess, to crudely summarize that.
It's a directory of how the public should be worshipped.
Right. I know it's in the name, but still, it's how you are to worship. The minimum requirements within church, and then the private worship is how you ought to conduct the worship in your home. Yeah. And I think we Protestants are horrible at adhering to either of those standards, which are actually quite beautiful. But with that, I came to the realization in pondering modern evangelicalism, that matter of, because my big thing has been on church tradition, namely on worship, on doxology, on liturgy. I am not so much influenced by any Puritan heritage, so much as modern evangelical heritage and influence, and crudely put, infection. So I've come to the conclusion to draw the parallels between what was the Westminster, the directories of public and private worship. I would say that the modern evangelical equivalent are the books, The Purpose-Driven Church and The Purpose-Driven Life. So your purpose-driven,
and evil that they are.
Right, because the purpose-driven church is your directory of public worship. This is how the church should be structured. This is how worship is structured. This is what's most important. And then the private worship is not even concerned with family worship, which the Westminster was. It's concerned about you, the individual, which is telling even more. So if you want to learn about, though it wasn't intended to be, I think they're still probably the best representations. If you want a good working definition of what modern evangelicalism is, or evangelicalism as we understand it in a modern context, those two books are probably the best, the most accurate writings defining those structures for both public and private worship. And when you read them, you come to realize just how prevalent those dogmas and creeds have become within almost every modern denomination. I mean, and again, I fancy myself somewhat a Puritan at heart, and even more so now that I'm actually being educated within Puritanism, which is a beautiful tradition. But I'm realizing a lot of things were not Puritan. They were not Reformed. They were modern evangelical. And I could probably find them better in Warren's books than I could in the Cambridge or in the Westminster Standards. So if you want to know what modern evangelicalism is, go read those books.
It's almost, though, neo-evangelicalism, if I can borrow a term, which I'm not sure I'm using correctly, because that term does exist. Because, like I said, I originally was like proud to be evangelical. I was card carrying because in the late 80s and early 90s, when I came to faith, there was basically two options. You were liberal Protestant or you're evangelical Protestant.
Right.
Liberal Protestants are heretics. Evangelical Protestants are conservatives. And again, the real founder of it is really Billy Graham and the folks who created Christianity Today. Again, I think it was like in the 40s and 50s. Was it Harold Ockenegg or something of that nature? History slipping. Carl Henry, I think, was also another major founder. And so again, they wanted this large movement that didn't exclude the different flavors of conservative Protestantism, but to unite together to save the country, to keep the country from falling into disrepair, so on and so forth. I am not sure if you took the purpose-driven life and the purpose-driven church and you went back to, I don't know, 1955 and gave these books to Billy Graham and Carl Henry, what they would say.
I think they'd
Because
excommunicate you.
hopefully. But I mean, because I mean, they really the original evangelicals were really like, we're not liberals.
Right.
Again, but we're not fundamental. We're not the bad sense of the narrow sense, the fundamentalists. But they definitely opened the door to this kind of modern piety, which I must confess I really dislike. But I remember that was a shock, because when I was actually in seminary of all places, I started to realize that this 20th century evangelicalism was different than historic Protestantism, because one of the most important things in the early version of evangelicalism is, are you born again? Are you really born again? Have you invited Jesus into your heart? That lingo, which in some ways I hear less and less. I mean, think of Billy Graham. I mean, literally has a book, Are You Born Again? How to Be Born Again. And I remember, like, we'd sit around and debate whether Luther or Calvin or Aquinas or Augustine were born again. And it was a real shock when I started reading church history. I'm like, they don't sound like modern evangelicals. I just assumed modern evangelicalism, that was biblical Christianity.
Right.
And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. So wait, maybe Luther wasn't born again, or maybe Augustine, or maybe not Paul. And
Right.
and you have this revelation. It's like, oh, it's the modern guys that are wrong.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, my whole Christian walk has been trying to purge those modern things, first of liberalism, and then of evangelicalism, and especially modern evangelicalism, which is even more shallow, more horrible, more just vapor. So, and returning back to something that is more solid. And I know, I mean, I suggested you a couple weeks ago to read the Standards, and it's like, wow,
Yeah.
what a different thing that is. What a different approach. But that drift, and this may be for another video, that drift from Reformation to Puritanism to evangelicalism to what I call pop evangelicalism. I think
Okay.
Warren and who's the other guy? Joel Osteen. I call them pop evangelicalism, because it's evangelicalism even more shallow.
Right. We're also
Basically,
dating ourselves, because I think there are more famous modern pop evangelicalists out there now
oh,
that
oh,
I like. I always try to think of, like,
yeah,
Stephen Furtick, I guess, is
no,
probably
yeah, he's horrible.
he's the most current generation evangelical that I can think of.
Yeah.
I don't know if he's ever written a book, so I don't know.
Yes, he has.
Has he? Okay, good. At least
That's
he
an
has that
interesting
going
point,
for him.
because
Uh,
I believe he has his background from MacArthur,
wow.
and so which is, of course, Reformed Baptist hardcore,
Right.
and so he wanted the academic, the credentials, the theological credentials, like, look, of this Reformed deep tradition.
Right.
But I can run around with squirt guns during a sermon and squirt the parishioners, and just preach relevant, practical sermons.
Right.
And there was a real split. I mean, MacArthur came out and said, no, this guy's terrible, and he wrote a book responding to MacArthur.
Huh.
So, but again,
Interesting.
evangelicalism is that weird combination of 19th century Princetonian conservative theology and 19th century practical revivalism.
Right. Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah. I don't.
sorry,
No, no, go ahead.
I've always thought, would it be best, and this is a working theory I've had for a few years, to divide historic Protestantism into really three camps? There is reformational Protestantism, which is Luther, Calvin, the Westminster Standards, that old form.
Mm-hmm.
There is rationalism of the 19th century, liberalism. And then there is revivalism, that focus of that individual piety and that conversion. Would that be a better description of describing the three basic tenets of Protestantism: reformationalism, rationalism, and revivalism? As
Right.
I've gotten older, I am much more a man of the Reformation.
Right.
And that's actually pretty hard to find, because there was a movement, was it called the confessing evangelical movement, or confessing Protestant movement? Oh, it started in Gordon Conwell, and the great congregational theologian, probably the last congregation alive. Oh, what's his name? He started it, and it was an attempt to return evangelicalism away from its shallow moorings to its historic foundations of creedal Christianity.
Right.
And it kind of caught on. I mean, I guess I'm a byproduct of it in some ways,
Right.
but it hasn't fully caught on, because, I mean, when you look at what modern evangelical is, you're right. Stephen Furtick and whatnot, they have these huge mega worship centers.
Right. Yeah, which is always far more, I, I
David
guess
Wells.
it's that matter of, even to approach it from how do you gauge if it's working? You've already
Yeah,
bought into, you've already
yeah,
bought
the
into
world.
the garbage. If you're
Yep.
combating the garbage by the same standards of the garbage. Um, uh, yes. So to your 3 points, I think that that works again chronologically, because that's an accurate representation of the main categories through which the Protestants have existed or traversed. Um, and then I guess you will, to a greater or lesser degree, fall into one of those three categories of non-Roman Catholic. And that's also, I mean, and just kind of, the quick point, because Protestant is contrast to Roman Catholic, but even Roman Catholicism has liberals and conservatives.
Sure.
So, I mean, I don't know that they have, I don't know that there are the equivalents of modern evangelicalism. I'm sure there must be. I mean, I kind of, as an outsider, I would only really kind of categorize them as very liberal, the Pope, or very conservative, being all of their mass is in Latin and that's the way it should be mentality.
Well,
I
I,
think those are your two extremes in Roman Catholicism.
well, it's interesting, because I have some very dear Roman Catholic friends, and I always argue with them that what the Protestants did in the 19th century, Rome is doing in the 21st
Right,
century.
right.
And that's my contention. You are not learning from our mistakes.
Right, right. Don't
No, no,
don't go
I
the
mean,
way we did.
if you go back and look at the 19th century, Protestantism owned this country. We've talked about this, but I
Yep.
mean, like, where are all the old Protestant schools? Well, there were the public schools.
Yep.
And the New York Times on Sunday would print famous Protestant sermons from New York on the front page. I mean, most of the hospitals, like you see this, like in St. Louis. Oh, there's the Baptist hospital, there's the Methodist hospital,
Yep.
there's the Presbyterian hospital. The denominations own the hospitals.
Right.
I mean, the power of mainstream Protestantism owned this country until really the late 20th century, and that just fell apart. And that was, to be blunt, the moral core of the country.
Right.
And half the reason why the country's falling apart is we've lost that mainline Protestant core. But the
Right.
gentleman I was thinking of, and it's well worth anyone's read out there, David Wells, wrote in 1994 his first of a volume series. The first book's the best. You can just get that one. It's called, and the title's interesting, No Place for Truth, or Whatever Happened to Evangelical Theology. So in 1994, a bunch of these conservative creedal Protestants were looking around, and he's like, what's going on here? What is supposedly is conservative Protestant Christianity is something very different. And he does a wonderful job. He goes back, I forget the name of the town in Massachusetts he researched, but he goes back to what Protestantism was back in this old, small 1820s Massachusetts town, and compares it with now the modern town and a modern evangelical church there. And he goes, it's fundamentally changed.
Right.
And of course, it's only gotten worse.
Right.
And trying to find places that are first reformed and then maybe evangelical, maybe that's hard to find. Like I said, it's one of the questions as I guide the new church that was started at the beginning of this year. I wanted to be reformed and put in the name
Right.
Trinity Reformed Church. We didn't put it evangelical. But what denomination should we join? Are the Presbyterian denominations? It's one of the questions I ask them. Are you guys first evangelical or first reformed?
Right.
And I think that's telling on how you answer that question.
So, oh boy, two
I don't know.
two things, but I'm only going to pick one because they both branch down
No.
very separate trains of thought. But I guess on that latter point, again, still the usage of the term. So reformed. So the contrast then, because evangelical used to be evangelical versus liberal.
Yeah.
And
That was
now
the popular
you're
20th century
contrasting
definition.
evangelical versus reformed
Versus conservative Protestant. So no, it's like include Lutherans.
No, I mean, because even if you ask, like, are you
reformed
or are you evangelical? It's like, well,
yeah.
Evangelical in that context could no longer signify conservative, because if you're reformed, you're conservative Protestant by modern terms. I mean, unless I'm using conservative improperly. But I mean, you're reformed, although I guess reformed is narrow, whereas evangelical.
You could be a liberal reformed. There are many Dutch. How many liberal Presbyterian, liberal Dutch Reformed churches are?
Right. Because Reformed is a tradition, right? Yeah. So right. Is that a matter? So you can have,
and so is evangelical. But again, that's going off tangent.
So are we talking about liberal theology within a Reformed? Again, to separate theology from doxology. Doxology including system of worship. So then are we separating, saying you can have liberal theology and Reformed doxology?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
So, but you could, can you have a liberal doxology?
You could have a Puritan style worship service and have really bad theology.
Well, that's one of the weird things in the late 20th century is the liberal churches theologically were crazy.
Right.
But their worship was very conservative.
Right.
And most evangelical churches were conservative in theology, or at least in morals, and liberal in worship. And I guess conservative Protestants are conservative in both. If you want one distinction.
Which we should be.
Yes.
You should be right. You should have biblical theology and doxology.
Yes. So So, but one thing, my contention is that evangelicalism is liberal, but in a different way.
Okay.
So if you go to a liberal Presbyterian church, a liberal Dutch Reformed church, they're 19th century liberals. It's rationalism. Of course, the virgin birth didn't exist. Of course, there's not the supernatural. Of course, there's not hell. We've evolved beyond that. We are reasonable, rational creatures.
Right.
So it's a rationalism that makes that liberalism. I think evangelicalism is liberal, focused on the self, but in a social and emotional way. So if you go to, again, Joel Osteen and Rick Warren, let's go to the two big ones, and you ask them for their statement of faith, they'll have this great statement of faith that's very conservative, inerrancy of scripture, little heaven and hell, yada, yada, yada.
Right.
But it has no impact on their preaching, teaching, or their doxology.
Right.
It's a different form of liberalism. And all liberalism is heresy.
Right.
So
okay,
and that's why if someone asks me generically what I am, I'm a conservative Protestant.
Sure.
I believe in the great, the authority of Scripture and the great doctrines, but also conservative in practice and in worship.
Right.
I want to be a man of the Reformation. I mean, what good came out of the 20th century when it comes to the faith? I am not sure there's much. There's
Not much.
some, but not much.
Can I can can I start identifying? I like using that term now, tongue in cheek.
Self-identify?
Can I
You
can
can
I
identify any way you want, my
right?
friend.
Can I identify as a Cambridge Congregationalist?
Yeah, well, yay, there's two of us now.
I think
Uh,
I think as far as both doxology and theology,
yep,
I'm finding the men who penned the Cambridge platform were really good with both of those, I think. So as matter of worship and as matter of theological understanding, I am I'm on board as a Cambridge Congregationalist. Can we make that an official denomination, and then we don't have to worry about the whole liberal Protestant thing? Oh,
well, that's a whole nother video I want
I
to
know.
do because
I'm not looking to rabbit
because
trail down church history.
no,
Um,
because I wish they existed. I think they're dead.
oh no, they are. Well, but one of the key tenets of the Christian faith is the resurrection. So let's bring them back. Um,
Sure.
so that
Or we
being
could just be,
aside,
or we could just become a Presbyterian.
just because I see, but that's the other thing that much like evangelical, it already has a meaning, and just using the term doesn't really explain anything because we just spent like the last 20 minutes saying, well, what is evangelicalism? We're like, well, here are the 30 different flavors of what evangelical can mean. I'm like,
Yep.
well, then that's messy. Um,
Yep.
so, but yes, to be reformed, to your question, to be reformed over being evangelical, and again, not to use the term evangelical to mean one who evangelizes, because that, I mean, in that sense, the church ought to be evangelical. The church ought
Yep.
to evangelize, obviously.
Yep. Yep.
Um,
Yep. Yep.
but as a tradition or as a denomination or as a whatever, like, and I kind of appreciate the concept behind evangelical being conservative Protestantism wanting a, I don't want to use the term generic because it didn't start off generic, wanting a lower bar for unity. I guess like how we had talked about um a church's statement of faith should be accessible, if you will, because it's the standard of to be a Christian, to be a member, sort of a thing, without getting into the details of, yes, you can be a Christian, but that doesn't make you reformed. Right. You can have statements about both, but the minimal should be, more of a generic, because I can't think of a different word. So evangelicalism being, we're not the liberals,
Yep.
I get. But so then I guess, yes, when you say, are you evangelical or are you reformed? That even if we took it by, the classic understanding of the, or the
Or
positive,
focus.
the positive evangelical,
Yeah.
and saying,
Yeah.
are you a conservative Protestant, which isn't bad,
Yeah.
evangelical, or are you reformed? Those are not the same things. Right.
Yeah. No, there's shade. I always put the question,
Okay.
which one are you more of?
Right.
Because I mean, like, if you again, the four great pillars of evangelicalism, do you believe that people should be converted? Yes. Do you believe in
Yep.
the authority of the Bible? Yes. Do you
Yep.
believe you should be focused on the cross? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And do you believe in activism? We'll define that in a broad, generic sense. Yeah, maybe.
Sure.
So because
I
that
believe,
then we're off.
right. We
Yeah.
should be
Yeah.
holy and we will
Yeah. Yeah.
impact the world in
But
which we live. But yes.
but with that also comes a doctrinal minimalism and a pragmatism, which I want no part of. And that has more and more ramped up. Again, I'm not sure, there has to be some transition here, but that I agree with you. In one way, Warren really hijacks it because if you look at Finney and whatnot, I mean, there's definitely a movement to make it popular, to make it accessible, but still there was a focus on conversion and holiness and whatnot.
Right.
For Warren, and then later for Olstein, it's primary just getting it's business techniques. I know
Yes.
Warren's theology, and I forgot the gentleman's name, is based on a marketing guru from the 1950s.
Right.
And when you read his marketing approach, it's purpose-driven church full on.
Right.
And that's an abomination.
Yes. Yes. Yes, it is. Just like that concept, which I've now grown to love to hate, the idea of servant leadership, and where I went
Yep.
and
The
looked into
focus is
that, and
on
I'm like, all
servant,
right,
not leader.
which theologian came up with that? And then I'm like, oh, never mind. It was a 1970s TED Talk, essentially, for business.
Yep.
Servant leadership is a business concept. I'm like, oh, let's strike that from our vocabulary. So yes. Yes, and you made a good point. He hijacked evangelicalism, essentially, and you see a lot of the Warren which is why I always call it Warrenism. You see a lot of Warrenism in the modern church, in a lot of denominations. Because again, it even makes the purpose of church isn't for the edification of the saints and the worship of God. It's for the unchurched, which Warren used that term quite frequently. It is
Yep.
for the unchurched. It is to be
Peter,
accessible to the unbeliever. Right. Church became
because that's
for
if
the
you read,
unbeliever.
if you have you read Purpose-Driven Church?
Yes, years ago,
Oh,
both Church
Lord
and
have mercy
Life.
on your soul.
I've read both of those
Because
a while ago.
I remember I almost did a Bible study on a little bit. Why I actually did it because like in the Purpose-Driven Life, it's like it's not about you, it's about God. And I said, if you listen to him very just carefully,
Yep.
every paragraph that's going to follow is no, it's all about you, it's all about you, it's all
No, it is
about
all
you.
about you.
That and of course that's the great hustle of evangelicalism is it gives the feeling, or sorry, pop evangelicalism, it gives the feeling that you're being devout and being a Bible believing Christian,
Right.
and it's really just being conformed to the world.
Right.
It is wretched, it is horrible. The purpose driven, I mean, the first piece of information, the first suggestion Rowan has in the Purpose Driven Church, that demonic evil book, is when you plant a new church, you go in, and the most important thing is the music, and you find what music taste the majority of the people in that place like. You orient the music towards their tastes, and you put most of your time and effort into that.
Mm-hmm.
You create essentially an effective concert.
Right.
And in the short term, it works.
Mm-hmm.
It terrifies me how many educated people I've met who buy into these kind of churches.
Right.
And I know what they're doing. I'm a successful lawyer. I'm a successful doctor. I'm a successful businessman. Obviously, I need to go to a pastor who's successful.
Right.
So that's it. They have 20,000 people at that church. They have to be doing it right because they're successful.
Right.
Very American.
Right.
And I'm like, you have like a PhD in legal studies,
right,
and you buy into this dribble?
Right.
I mean, it's shocking that people do that. And I'm like, here's Calvin, read Calvin. And like, oh, it's too hard to understand. I'm like, wait, what? it is so frustrating, but it has short term worked.
Right.
And it's, again, in the worldly sense of working, but man, what a price. I mean, I've always said if I was on a street corner, I had to go to church, no option, I have no choice on Sunday. And there was a crazy liberal congregational church with some she pastor with pink hair, a Rick Warren worship cafeteria gentleman's center, or a traditional Roman Catholic church. I'm gonna go to the Roman Catholic Church.
Right.
Can't join, won't take the suppers.
Right.
And I'm not trying to endorse Roman Catholicism, but the other two are just so horrible and weird in a weird sort of way. Though I think theological liberalism is complete heresy. In some ways, I have more respect for that because at least they're trying to help the poor. And that's
right.
like occasionally in the Bible. As opposed to evangelicalism, it's just about feeling good.
Right.
There's something really sick and insipid about it. And like to be the better person and have sermon series and learning how to organize your life. And don't get me going. Oh, by the way, the gentleman, it's Peter Drucker, if you want to know the reference. Peter Drucker died in 2005. I just looked it up. He was like this huge business guru. And if you read, had huge influence on many people. including Rick Warren.
Right.
Really, the apostle of Rick Warren is Peter Drucker, if
Okay.
you go and do some research on it. And
Right.
it's truly terrifying.
Yeah, on the on those differences, and again, I find it interesting. Um, I had a revelation the other day when talking about, church liturgy, high church versus low church, and influences of modern evangelicalism into that as well. But I had a just sort of a funny side thought that if you go to 12-step programs, NA or AA, they have better history and liturgy than most modern evangelical churches.
Yep.
All of their proceedings start with a reading of their traditions, their creedal statements. I mean, like, there is an actual system. Everybody reads, everybody professes it. They have their own books that you're supposed to read and study and know and learn. I mean, like, there's an amazing amount of the church, the assembly, even to that point of, as they always coin the phrase, it's a selfish program because it's for your recovery. But the emphasis, of course, is always on it has to be something beyond yourself because you're an addict.
Got a
And they
tremendous sense of brotherhood and sisterhood, and
right, even if it's something, even if it's the fellowship, which is that term used all the time, the fellowship can be your higher power, so on and so forth. It depends on how
yeah,
liberal you get in the meetings. But even liberal AA and NA meetings, they
yep,
still adhere to the traditions of those organizations, which all lead with the profession and statement that they're wretched, helpless addicts. Like, I laugh at how
yep,
these secular
yep,
organizations have, I mean, like, blood and stone written all of
yep.
these things and still to this day at least adhere to it. And then you look at the church, which has just gone, and I'm like, man, it's bad if you had the options, like you were saying, of those like three different denominations to go to. And I laugh and I'm like, throw an AA meeting into that mix. You'd probably be better off going to that too. Like, you might
You're
get
not
better
wrong.
theology and fellowship at an AA meeting than most modern evangelical churches.
No, absolutely. You're seeing. I mean, again, you're seeing pushback against it. I mean, to some extent, the Christian nationalist movement is pushing back against it pretty hard in some ways, though.
Uh-huh.
I think in some ways it compromises itself.
Uh-huh.
Um,
They're
well,
they're
I
they're
mean, sorry.
pragmatic as well.
Oh no,
As
and they'll do them in like it did the 18th century
right.
Congregationalists.
As much as they want
I
to
thought,
go all of
yeah,
Christ for all of life, they really just
yeah,
mean Christianize everything and find some allies. And I'm
yeah.
like, you're all of Christ for all of life is really just more so make this world as Christian as possible because that's the point of the church. It's a form of theological liberalism, right? I mean,
Oh,
it's like help
oh,
the
it's
poor. I'm like,
well,
okay,
they hate this. It's pietism.
it is piety.
Instead of having an internal focus on a theology of glory, they have an
Right,
external focus on a theology of
right,
glory.
right.
They get mad when I say that, but
No, that's
that's
fine.
okay.
No, Christian
Um,
nationalism definitely has is just
yeah.
wrought with
but
pitfalls and inevitable
but
failings.
right, but their critique is that, and this I agree with. Even modern evangelicalism is way too feminized, way
Sure,
too soft.
sure.
That's 100% true.
Yes.
And the critique, a lot of the critique, I think is spot on. It's the answer sometimes get me a little bit nervous. Um, but so, but guys, going back full circle, yeah, the label, like, I mean, I don't hear the label Protestant much anymore. I think you're right. It's
No.
usually just we're not Catholics.
Right.
But many sociologists have pointed out it is actually again the big change in late 20th, early 21st century America is the downfall of the Protestant hegemony. That I mean, every single university was made for Protestants.
Right.
I had a laugh. Ben Shapiro read from the original president of Columbia University, And of course, the purpose of Columbia, which now have all these crazy riots by these cosplaying terrorists, is the main purpose was to create Christians who could think,
Right.
but Protestant Christians.
Right.
So yeah, I'm not
Which,
sure. Well, sorry.
oh no, I mean, and to that point, and again, I guess sort of to, uh, it's sad, of course, to see the downfall of secular society when, in this particular case, Protestantism declines. However, Protestantism have never been societal. It should have always just been church. And this, I mean, like, I think the greater tragedy isn't that, as tragic as it is, your Protestant educational institutions are now, hotbeds for communists. Um, so be it. But the greater tragedy is that your churches are worldly. Of course, I mean, like, it sucks that what once was a Christian secular institution is now just a secular institution. Um,
Yeah.
the greater tragedy is that when the Christian institution, the church, becomes a secular institution. And I think evangelicalism, modern evangelicalism, um, I don't know. It just seems it's it's so watered down, generic, even to that point of theological liberalism and heresy, that it allows you to feel good, kind of like as you said, it allows you to feel pious, but not actually have any real Christianity to it.
How many? I mean, I've seen on TV, you'll have this like shallow Instagram influencer and just complete Hollywood, and then totally just pagan, or at least just earthly in out language and dress, and then we'll say, "Oh yeah," and then I go to this giant mega evangelical church because I love Jesus.
Right.
And it's like, but zipping back,
Yes.
it's interesting the title because in the 1990s, again, people like Wells and James Montgomery Boyce and other folks tried to push evangelicalism back to a more solid foundation. And the name of the organization is called the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, which again, the title is interesting because we're still evangelicals. We like that label. We ain't liberals.
Right.
But it became at least a tag phrase for a while. Are you confessional? So like if you go, let's say the four C's, the Conservative Evangelical Christian Conference, there's a lot, and increasingly so, just generic pop evangelicals. But to kind of prove that you're among fellow travelers would be like, you would ask, are you confessional? Do you have a confessional creed that defines you? Not some minimalistic 10-point statement of faith, but
Right.
I'm a Westminster man, or insert whatever.
Right.
Fun fact, I didn't know this. The Evangelical for Confessing, the Alliance for Confessing Evangelicals still exists. And I didn't realize the podcast Mortification of Spin is part of them.
I've
So
never heard of
they're
that
still.
podcast. It's
Oh, it
clever
is. Yeah.
though.
Oh, I thought it's pretty famous. I love the Mortification of Spin. Yeah, that's
Yep.
just it's
That's
a cute
good.
name.
I like it.
So they're still around and they're still going. Um, and
Cool.
but like I said, it is interesting because like I know it's one of the big debates. Repeating myself now for the third time, is less. Well, no, the Lutherans went through this too, but trying to discern where Presbyterians are at, because Congregationalism is dead. I really do believe that. And so if you're not a Congregationalist, what's their kissing cousins? Well, it's the Presbyterians. But are modern evangelical Presbyterian churches more evangelical than Reformed? And like I said, I've been starting to ask that question, and I get interesting answers.
Right. Right. No, and I do understand the purpose of the context of the question, which is, again, that matter of, if you're going to evaluate to join a denomination, having that be answerable, and also how to answer that yourself as a congregation, as a pastor, as the congregants. That is good to be able to answer. And yes, I agree that Cambridge Congregationalism is dead. But on the flip side, that also gives you the opportunity of resurrecting it, because It's also, well, no, because Congregationalist churches still exist. The denomination still exists. So I guess you couldn't get away with it.
And I
Everything.
would sell the name. I would sell out the name, to get everything else. I'd sell the name. But then again, if there was a really solid Anglican church, I'd be tempted.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just, well,
Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Yeah, sure.
If someone comes up to you and
Mm-mm.
honestly asks, could you tell me what type of Christian you are?
No.
But they don't have much background in the labels.
Also no. Even less no. Or more no. Could I
How would you answer that question?
What kind of a Christian are you? But talk to me like I'm a small child.
Yes. Well, because we can, if you start, well,
Right.
I'm of the Cambridge Congregational from 60. I mean,
Right.
you're going to
Cambridge
be, but
Congregationalist. I don't know what
I
either of
mean,
those are.
because they might know Protestant, maybe
Right.
they might know Evangelical,
I-
and
Right.
and the generic words conservative and liberal in the political sense they would know.
Yeah.
How would you answer the question?
I tend to on that, like I tend to use Protestant, even not only because it's a differentiation between, Roman Catholic and not Roman Catholic, which is, a plus, but because the only people who tend to use Protestant are more reformed leaning. I think a lot of modern Christians, actual Christians, regardless of whatever, don't tend to use the term Protestant.
Yeah.
They would use whatever their denomination is, or I'm fine with, if you didn't really know much about anything, I tend to go with Protestant. But even that, I guess it doesn't help because it's such an uncommon term. They might not even really understand what you mean by
Right.
that.
It used to, like again, World War II generation, everyone knew Protestant wasn't Catholic. You were
Right.
the mainstream.
Right.
I use the term, obviously, if you need time to unpack, but I use the term conservative Protestant
Yes. Yes. I like your
because
qualifier.
like, yeah, because if someone says like, "Are you an evangelical?" I'm like, "No,"
No.
and then
No, I'd never
that,
describe myself as evangelical.
yeah, which is interesting because, like I said, I've completely flipped because that was the title. If
Right.
you talk to me back in the mid '90s, what are you? First thing out of my mouth, I'm an evangelical,
Right.
which meant I'm not a liberal and I'm a
Right.
Protestant.
Right.
But
Yeah, so
yeah,
conservative Protestant would work. That still assumes you really understand what
if you say
Protestantism is.
confessional Protestant or confessional evangelical, I was like, well, then what's confessional? That's a much more technical term.
Right. I like confessional again because that assumes you have a
Yeah.
confession. So if you have,
But I know,
some
and like,
confession of faith, Westminster
well,
Baptist,
because older
Cambridge, well, not
conservative,
really Cambridge.
I've noticed like older conservative folks who come by TRC, they'll ask me if I'm confessional, but they're using that 1990s language, which is now terrifyingly 30 years old. Um,
Yep.
but that was the code word. It's like, oh, so you're not a liberal, you're an evangelical, but you're not one of those modern evangelicals. You
Right.
are confessional.
Confessional.
I know you're reading a ton of stuff, but if you ever
I
get a
am.
chance, David Wells' No Place for Truth.
Okay.
That's an interesting discussion of the huge change that happened in the 20th century. Um, and the other one, just, I mean, Marsden, a guy named George Marsden, wrote extensively of the rise of fundamentalism and then evangelicalism. Because it's interesting, you're seeing some of the more confessional types start saying, well, maybe the fundamentals weren't 100% wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, then you have to define fundamentalism, and that has different definitions.
Certainly if you're down south, because the
Well,
only the only
would you label
fundamentalists
yourself
down
as
here are the independent fundamental Baptists,
exactly?
which
Would you label
aren't
yourself as a
which
fundamentalist?
aren't completely wrong. I want to always point out
Exactly. Oh no,
they catch a
exactly.
lot of
It-
flack down here, but you look
yeah,
at them and I'm like, I don't know. They've done pretty
yeah,
well in safeguarding certain core aspects of the Christian
yeah.
faith. So,
Oh, if I had a choice between an IFB or again Joel Osteen, that's a
oh,
no-brainer.
I
If
would
that's
take
those are our
I
choice.
I'd take IFB
Yeah,
over most modern mainline denominations without, in a heartbeat.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
easy. Be like, all right, I'm even good with the King James. I'm like, I'll fit right in.
I'm young Earth, and
Yep,
I
I'm
like
young
the King
Earth.
James.
I am
Yeah.
all I prefer the
The
NKJV.
Calvinism and the
Just
decision theology would get me in trouble, but that's okay.
yeah,
They
yeah.
hate Calvinists, and the decision theology is just like nah.
Right.
But
Other than that pesky Calvinist thing.
yes, yes.
Um, but no,
No,
I'd rather just be IFB over most mainline
no,
denominations. At least they can answer to you what a woman is.
right?
So and you know who the women are because they're all wearing dresses because you
Yep,
have to.
yep,
Um, so it works out really well. Um, yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I don't use the term evangelical in a positive way. I'd certainly never identify
yep,
with it. If anybody
yep.
asked which am I first, I'd probably sidestep even using the evangelical as a part of a descriptor for myself. Which again, I think for clarity, for sake of clarity. But if I were in a position of, are we going to join a denomination, and that term is something that is, prevalent, prolific within Christianity, because the last I checked, which has been a while, but Wilson even tried to, and maybe is still trying to reclaim that term. And I think it may be because of the it meant conservative. Um,
Yes,
and so like, because for me, it doesn't mean conservative. It's never meant conservative to me.
yeah,
But I mean, like, if you're of the older generation, where Wilson and yourself, um, if it meant conservative, that's not a bad thing to want to bring back, right? So I, I can I can see that. But I don't know. I'd probably, if I had to, even given all the definitions, I'd go reformed over evangelical, without too much problem.
well, I mean, again, if they don't know the terms,
Right.
I'm conservative Protestant, and then if they know a little bit of the terms, next line of that is Reformed.
Right.
That's and though I'm more of the Westminster standards, I don't mind the three fountains of headship. I'm getting tired. The three basic standards of the continental tradition. The Westminster. Oh, sorry. Oh, come on, Doug. Wow. The Heidelberg Catechism,
Yep.
the Councils of Dort,
Yep.
and the Belgic Confession. And that's the three something something of the Reformed tradition. Now
Right.
I gotta look that up.
Yes, and those are beautiful. I mean,
Yeah. Oh, they are.
the canons of Dort aren't beautiful, objectively. They are objectively
Is that
ugly.
agreement?
Theologically, they're great. They should be rewritten by somebody who can organize better. It's not an easy read, but it is good theology. The Belgian Confession is very good. I think of those three though, the Heidelberg
It's
Catechism
beautiful.
is absolutely beautiful. Good old, I mean, that's one of those things that the Germans just contributed wonderfully. Um, and so every now and then a good thing comes out of Germany. The Augsburg Confession also, I know that's very Lutheran, but that's also a very beautiful confession. It's not Reformed because Lutherans aren't Reformed, they're Lutheran. But I certainly did appreciate the Augsburg. But yeah, I'm with you. I am all on board with the Westminster Standards, excluding their particulars on church government and the presbytery. Um, so I guess that makes me a Congregationalist all the more because they liked the confessions, they just hated their government. So
Three forms of unity,
I
it's
agree.
called.
Okay.
Three forms of unity, that's officially the Belgic, the Dort, and Heidelberg. That's, I mean, where we have Westminster standards, they have
Right.
the three forms of unity, which are again just beautiful.
Yep. Oh yeah.
And most of the Reformed tradition, whether continental or English Puritan, we go back and forth.
Right.
So,
Right.
well, we're actually towards the hour mark here.
Yeah, we are.
So,
I'm good. I don't think I
yep,
have
our
anything.
first afternoon podcast, and it
Hmm.
shows. So, us old people work better in the morning.
Yes.
The brain's a little more spry.
Yep.
Any closing thoughts, my friend?
Uh no, yes. Church history matters. And church
Amen.
history started before your conversion,
Right,
so read it.
right.
That's my closing thoughts.
We stand on shoulders of those
Right,
who went before us
right.
and be foolish not to recognize.
Yep.
No, amen. So yeah, like I said, I think there is a difference between Protestant and evangelical.
Yeah. Yeah.
Protestant is a category description of several things underneath it.
Hmm.
Evangelical, I think, it tries to be that, or unintentionally became that and became subversive. I think it's a separate tradition now. I
Yeah.
think there's a distinction. Oh, there's an evangelical, there's a Lutheran, and there's a Reformed.
Right.
And
Right.
there's a lot of bleed over, especially maybe more so in the Reformed tradition. No, Lutherans have their pietists,
Hmm.
where they claim the label, but they're much more functionally evangelical. I'm sorry, I'm off on a
Right.
tangent here, but like I've met Lutheran pastors, they are evangelical, and I'm more Lutheran.
Right.
And it's in their thinking, even though
Right.
their worship may be pretty high church and they go to a conservative Lutheran church, how they think and how they view the world is definitely much more evangelical
Right.
than Lutheran,
Right.
which I find interesting.
Yep.
So,
Yes.
so a tangent.
No, I think
So,
that's a
well,
good summary. Yeah.
yeah.
Even yeah, yep. I like that concluding the
Okay.
that categorization. That helps.
Well, as always, thank you, my friend, and thank you for you
Yes.
folks listening to Internet Land. We will try to do better next time. At least I would, and hopefully we'll do it at 9 o'clock instead of the glorious
Eh,
afternoon.
you
But
know what?
yeah,
Everything can't be perfect.
amen, amen. But no, this was a helpful conversation. So
Yeah,
thank
yeah,
you
yeah.
very much,
All right.
and blessings to y'all.
Yes, take care.